from British biotech company Oxitec to potentially release up to 2 billion genetically engineered mosquitoes in Tulare County in California's Central Valley. Last year, the US EPA approved an experimental use permit, which would allow for this release. And now the final decision falls to the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, which could allow or deny the release. We are recommending that DPR deny Oxitec's application for a permit. And as you listen to the following presentations, you'll learn that there are significant concerns for the environment, public health, and environmental justice that are being raised related to the experimental release of these mosquitoes. You'll also learn that we don't have the regulatory structures at the state or federal levels that would enable responsible oversight of this totally novel technology. And you'll learn that Oxitec's previous field trials have failed and that the company has refused to share much of its data publicly. Finally, you'll learn that there are proven safer approaches for controlling mosquitoes in California. So now I'm honored to introduce our speakers for today, beginning with JD Hansen, who is the Policy Director at the Center for Food Safety and is a leading expert on genetically engineered insects and animals. We also have Nan Wishner, who is the founding board member of the California Environmental Health Initiative, which is an organization fighting to stop state-sponsored pesticide spraying that affects local communities. And lastly, we will hear from Angel Garcia, who is the co-director of Californians for Pesticide Reform, which is a coalition that works to protect communities from harmful pesticides. And Angel is also a resident of Tulare County. So with that, I will pass it to JD.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm to talk about what a G mosquito is first, and in this case, it's a particular mosquito that we're talking about. There are many mosquitoes that could be genetically engineered, but this is the Aedes aegypti mosquito. Colloquial name is the yellow fever mosquito. Scientists have been working on this mosquito, one way or the other, for about 125 years now. This is a mosquito that likes to breed around where people live. In our houses, in our flower pots, in little puddles in front of our houses. So it has easy access to humans. The good news is so far there are no California originated cases of the diseases that this mosquito can cause, which are Zika, dengue fever, chikungunya, yellow fever, any of the viruses scientists call flaviviruses. So why is the company working to genetically engineer a mosquito, and how are they doing it? What they've done with this mosquito is genetically engineer the females to die if they don't get tetracycline, which is a odd way of doing it, but that's what they've done. And what they're planning to do is release a couple of billion of them in California. And the problem that California's got right now, and I'm originally from the Central Valley myself, and know that mosquitoes can be a problem. But while limiting the spread of mosquito-borne diseases, once these mosquitoes are released in the wild, there really is no way of calling them back. And there have been a number of concerns about this mosquito where they've been tested elsewhere. So going to the next slide. Again, this mosquito experiment is not necessary. Previous Oxitec experiments in the Cayman Islands, Malaysia, Panama, and Brazil have failed to reduce mosquito populations. The field trials in the Cayman Islands showed no significant reduction of the mosquitoes and an increase in biting females that we're worried about. So this experiment may create more environmental and public health problems than we have now. And Oxitec has not been transparent about the human health and environmental effects. In a way, we are being asked to be the field trial for Europe, where Oxitec is based. When Oxitec wanted to do a field trial in Spain, the authorities wanted more information. They wanted information on the human and environmental effects. Oxitec said no, and left Europe, and they've been going everywhere else pretty much since. But the United States is now where they've settled. Next slide. Well, and as mentioned earlier, these GE female mosquitoes may survive and spread more diseases. In Brazil, the only really independent study of this company's work found that the GE mosquitoes survived, increased mosquito populations, developed hybrid wild GE mosquitoes that may be more virulent than the current mosquitoes they have or this mosquito itself. Now, if the GE mosquitoes get out, if the females survive, the Environmental Protection Agency requires that huge amounts of pesticides be used to kill them all. That means that if this doesn't work, and we don't think it will work, that you'll end up using, at least in the short term, a huge amount of pesticides that you wouldn't have to use. And finally, in this area of concerns, one of the things as a asthmatic that particularly bothered me, and someone that reacts a lot to mosquito bites as well, is that we can tell from the EPA documents that we've gotten on Freedom of Information request that the company does have a lot of data on the allergens that people will be exposed to in this experiment, but they've called it confidential business information and kept it from us all. Next slide. I mean, the good news is that there are other products that will do this and do it better in development and starting to be used. In the Fresno area, there's already been a trial of a Wolbachia mosquito, very clever, non-genetically engineered mosquito, but it's a mosquito that naturally contains a bacteria, and they swapped out the bacteria that it's supposed to contain in the males, put it in a new bacteria, and when they breed, the eggs don't hatch. So unlike the Oxitec experiment, the Wolbachia trials show that you don't have to have a technique that makes more females that are released. You can have a mosquito, the Wolbachia infected mosquito, released, and they breed with the unaffected mosquitoes in the population, they lay eggs, but the eggs won't hatch. Just this week, the Environmental Protection Agency approved this to address bird malaria in Hawaii. And that was endorsed by a number of the Hawaii environmental protection groups. So what should we do? Walter Reed in 1898 figured out how to control yellow fever mosquitoes, which these are in the Panama Canal Zone, and greatly eliminated what would have been thousands and thousands of deaths during that war. So we can do a lot of what he did. We can minimize exposure to mosquitoes. We can use mosquito repellents that are not very toxic. We can dump all standing water. We can manage the larvae with effective biological controls that you can get at your local hardware store. We can put mosquito fish in ponds, and simply making sure that the poorest populations have screens for their homes and have places that they can be in the evening hours and the early morning hours that are screened will eliminate the risk. I think that's
Thank you, JD.
Thank you.
And we will be moving on to Nan.
Thanks, Malika. Thanks, JD. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I speak quickly, so if I go too fast, make sure you ask me questions at the end. I want to add just a couple of details about the mosquitoes. First of all, for those who don't know, female mosquitoes are the ones who bite. Male mosquitoes don't bite. So if females get loose in this trial, that's who's going to be biting individual humans. And second, about the tetracycline that the females, these genetically engineered Oxitec female mosquitoes need to survive. That's an antibiotic, you probably know. And one of the concerns in this case is that tetracycline is now being widely sprayed on citrus orchards for controlling citrus greening disease. So there are huge amounts of tetracycline in the environment in Tulare County where these mosquitoes are proposed to be released. And by the way, Oxitec did apply to release them in 11 other counties, although that wasn't approved by the EPA. So this is not just a Tulare County issue. So with those risks in mind, and I'm here to say, on the one hand, yes, it's true what Malika said. We don't really have the appropriate regulatory structure for this situation. This would be the very first release ever of a genetically engineered animal of any kind in California. We have no regulations or a structure for analyzing such a proposal. And as we mentioned, it's letting a genie out of a bottle. We're letting an exotic disease-carrying insect that's genetically engineered freely out into the environment if this experiment is approved. So it's an irreversible kind of situation. The good news is California does have among the strongest environmental regulations in the country, in the form of the California Environmental Quality Act. You've probably heard, or CEQA for short, you've probably heard CEQA getting beaten up a little bit in the news recently by housing advocates. We're not talking about housing here. What we're talking about here is a textbook case of what CEQA was created for, a case of a proposed project that could have potentially serious and irreversible harmful impacts on human and environmental health. And what CEQA requires is that before you make a decision about a project like that, you fully analyze it from many required angles comprehensively, and you allow for extensive public input, and the agency that's overseeing the analysis of the project also is then required to transparently respond to all that input. It's a very carefully choreographed process, and it results in an environmental impact report, which documents everything that has gone on in the process of evaluating the proposal. The purpose of CEQA is to answer the questions before you take the action, not to take the action and then ask the questions later. The issue here is that the Department of Pesticide Regulation, or DPR, operates under what's called a certified regulatory program that gives them a lot of leeway about whether and how they apply CEQA. This was Their certified regulatory program was approved in the mid-1970s, not long after CEQA was adopted, because large agriculture interests were afraid that if DPR had to do an environmental impact report for every single pesticide and every use of every pesticide, we'd never have pesticides and agriculture would be disrupted. And so DPR was given this kind of loophole to carry out the general focus of CEQA however they saw fit. And the problems of applying CEQA in that way to this particular proposal are that DPR does not have anybody in-house who knows about genetically engineered insects. There are no scientists on staff who are experienced in this. And they have they don't have any requirements about whether and how they have to take or respond to public comment. And we're especially concerned about how they do this analysis, how comprehensive it is, because whatever they do is going to set a precedent for any future proposal to release any genetically engineered insect. And this insect is not a pesticide. DPR is accustomed to evaluating pesticides, which are chemical substances that are sprayed and that essentially stay where they're sprayed unless there's some drift. Mosquitoes have wings. They can go wherever they want. Have I been muted the whole time?
No, I think that just occurred, Nan. 10 seconds.
Wow. Okay, good. So we think that DPR should be required to do, it should not be able to do the sort of modified certified regulatory program analysis in this case. They should have to do a full CEQA analysis that includes disclosing all of the data about the mosquito, not just depending on what Oxitec chooses to disclose, that offers very clear, defined public comment that are sensitive to the communities where these mosquitoes would be released. So that would include materials in the languages of the people who live there and so on. And would include looking at all the data, for example, from the recent field trials in Florida, which have so far not been included in the evaluation process. A comprehensive CEQA analysis also involves the other state agencies whose purview is implicated. For example, in this case, it would be the Natural Resources Agency, the Department of Public Health, and within Cal EPA, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment should also be involved in a decision making a decision like this. Really important in CEQA is that the agency is required to consider alternatives. It doesn't just look at a proposal in isolation. It has to look at what are other ways to achieve the same goal of reducing mosquito populations or controlling them. And as you heard from JD, there's a much more effective, if you want to use an insect to control the mosquitoes, there's a much more effective proposal already far along in the pipeline. The Wolbachia mosquito is much safer. CEQA requires that an agency choose the least environmentally harmful alternative. So requiring DPR to do a comparison of options would be super important in this case. We also think because DPR doesn't have in-house access, they should employ a scientific advisory panel to know about genetically engineered. And finally, if DPR did decide to go forward with this proposal, one of the things CEQA requires is that there be both monitoring and mitigation for any harmful environmental or health impacts that the project might cause. Oxitec, of course, is proposing to do its own monitoring and mitigation. It's going to tell us whether any female mosquitoes get out and bite people. And that's the old adage is the fox guarding the hen house. You really want either an independent agency or the state to be doing the monitoring and mitigation so that there's not a conflict of interest. I hope this brief and high-speed summary tells you exactly how the regulatory or apparatus that we have can do much of the job that we need to be done. I'm happy to answer questions later. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nan. And next up, we have Angel.
Yes. So first of all, good afternoon, and thank you for joining this meeting. So briefly, Tulare County. Well, Tulare County, first of all, has an overall population of just over 482,000 people. This, according to the latest census data available. It is a county that is a farming, working class, multilingual, racially diverse, and it's a county where that has the second lowest literacy rate in the state. In fact, an interesting fact here is there's only one new bookstore in all of Tulare County. So that really just tells the story of how this community is literacy rate is very very low, generally speaking. Also, it's a county where over half the population speak a language other than English at home. And then also important is that there's 10% of the population are farm workers, 23, just over 23% immigrant, 3% indigenous, and I want to note here that when the 3% indigenous is that's really hard to accurately capture data that really paints the whole picture when it comes to indigenous Mexican farm workers, which is the most recent wave of farm worker labor that happens in all of the San Joaquin Valley as well as in the Central Coast. Also, Tulare County is one where dairy has the most dairy operations in all of the state, has the highest concentrations of animal workers. It's also a community that's already overburdened with environmental justice issues. For example, it has consistently ranked third or in the top 3 when it comes to overall agricultural pesticide use in California. Only third and only behind Kern and Fresno counties. And that order ranges from year to year, but Tulare seems to consistently be ranking third when it comes to overall agricultural pesticide use. And then also, we can't really talk about Tulare County without a mention of the recent floods that took place earlier this year, where even to this day, the damage is being tallied and calculated, but where over 680 structures were impacted by the recent floods. In fact, some of them happen in the smaller communities that dot the county, and these communities are often where a lot of farm worker families live. And then also, next slide, please. Also important is, with that information in mind, just quickly, there's been little publicly available information about the release of where in the county the release of these genetically engineered mosquitoes will take place, and what are the impacts. We don't know that information, and insofar, the Oxitec has blocked key public health information that it is important for DPR to make its decision about its release. It's been almost a sort of a secretive process on Oxitec's end. Also important, communities have a right to be fully informed about the decision-making process, and that just has not happened. Take, for example, last year where the public participation was very disrespectful, and DPR only gave a 15 days for the first public comment period back in April of 2022. And there's been no clear date on when the second public comment will take place. There's been no outreach, no oral comments or presentations, no information on which to comment on. The process has been mostly all in English and via email. So there's just been really no public meetings that have been set for community input thus far. Next slide, please. Also important, we cannot mention, or we cannot talk about Tulare County without a mention of the digital divide. Many community members do not have access to computers or internet. For example, there was a brief sort of survey study done, which highlighted that out of all mid-sized U.S. metro areas, the Visalia-Porterville area had the 5th lowest percentage of households with internet access. Additionally, Oxitec has had no respect for communities and has a history of violating community trust, as it did in the Florida Keys in 2021. The community does not want nor need this experiment, and the community should have the right to opt out and decide what feels safest for their neighborhoods. People should have the right to free and prior informed consent, the right to decide for ourselves, because I include myself as a Tulare County resident, to receive this full information. So just to keep, in the purpose of time, I would now like to conclude this and thank you for your time and attention. And I'll pass it over to Malika.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, JD, Nan, and Angel. We have several questions and we'll try to be brief so we can get to each one. And so the first question we have is, what is the reasoning for not making the information public? JD, maybe it'd be best if you answer that question first.
One of the things we've been pushing the US EPA about is it's agreeing with the company that everything has to be on the company's terms. Confidential business information is the claim the company wants to make. And so they're saying that where they are deploying these and how many and how they're collecting it is all in the purview of the company, and the EPA is allowing them to get away with that. In Europe, they weren't allowed to get away with functioning that way, and they left.
Nan and Angel, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think that's clear. And just to say that DPR has also so far not required that information to be disclosed, which they could do even though US EPA did not.
Angel, anything to add?
Just to know that this is a pattern that is been seen in other issues relating to pesticides, where public participation hasn't always been very readily available to community. That has made progress recently, but historically, the community has had to push for that to happen at the Department of Pesticide Regulation.
Thank you all. We have another question asking where we can get a copy of the report. So we'll be following up with materials, including an issue brief and our comments to the DPR as well as Oxitex applications.
Yeah, there's a question in the Q&A about Wolbachia versus GE Aedes aegypti. Wolbachia mosquitoes aren't genetically engineered. They are infected with a different kind of Wolbachia bacteria than they normally carry. And the two different kinds, one being carried by the female and one being carried by a male, prevent the eggs from hatching. What are the drawbacks of Wolbachia mosquitoes? Because the eggs don't hatch, if you don't release enough of the male Wolbachia mosquitoes, you'll have to do another release. But that's environmentally a pretty safe approach. The GE Aedes aegypti mosquitoes have the risk of being able to find tetracycline, which there's a lot of in Tulare, and keep breeding. And if you're releasing billions of males to begin with, and then, more females hatch out that get the tetracycline, you're going to have a huge number of mosquitoes that you didn't plan for.
Thanks, JD. We do have time for a few more questions. Folks, please feel free to ask anything in the chat or in the Q&A box.
What does the Aedes aegypti females need? They're genetically engineered to need tetracycline to survive. Normally, we are using antibiotics to kill pathogens and to, and in effect, as pesticides themselves. In this case, you've got an antibiotic that's used by people that when these female mosquitoes get it, they keep living and breeding.
They actually require it in order, supposedly, to survive. And supposedly will die if they don't have it. That's a whole other question. But this touches on, if you're aware of all the disputes about overuse of antibiotics in agriculture, resulting in them becoming ineffective for use for disease when they're actually needed, both for humans and livestock. So this is a situation where this is a very commonly used antibiotic. I use it for respiratory infections in my goat herd, and it's effective, and we don't want it to lose its effectiveness. So, and because it's now being used as a pesticide in orchards, it's very widely distributed in the environment. So there's no guarantee that these female mosquitoes are actually going to die off, because tetracycline will be available to them freely in the environment.
Thanks, Nan. And we have another question, maybe Nan or Angel, you could answer. What's the plan for stopping the mosquitoes?
So I would say there are a couple of, there are lots of elements to that. Angel is more doing the work on the ground in Tulare County, but on the regulatory side, we are pressing DPR to do a full CEQA process, and we've provided comment letters, and we've provided data and requests for additional data to suggest where the loopholes or the holes are in their analysis process. And then on the ground, we're trying to organize folks to participate and respond. If you want to address that, Angel.
Absolutely. And then that sort of segues to Juan Carlos's question. In terms of the transparency, we have several people from Dinuba, Cutler Rossi area that have expressed major urgency and concern to have this be addressed. And as they put it, they don't want to be part of an experimentation that we have no with that experimentation that really don't know what is going to happen once these mosquitoes are released. So people, Juan Carlos, one of the things that perhaps the senator can do is meet with her members from her district and really hear directly from them the urgency on this, and maybe also connect with the Department of Pesticide Regulation and inform them that that the senator is concerned about the potential release of mosquitoes in her district.
I suppose it's also one effective thing that legislators can do is hold a hearing, a public hearing on a proposal like this. I know at the beginning of another pesticide/insect controversy a dozen years or so ago, several legislators held hearings either in their districts or in the Capitol. They had scientists come and talk about what was happening. They had ag commissioners come. If DPR isn't going to convene a scientific advisory panel, a legislator could certainly convene a hearing that would air some of these issues and potentially get some media coverage to them.
Great. Thank you all. It looks like we do not have any more questions. But thank you all for your questions and for attending. We will be following up with you all with some materials and the recording, as I mentioned earlier, and please feel free to follow up with any one of us with any additional questions or comments. With that, thank you all and have a wonderful weekend.